Hello everyone, this is Dr. Catalana. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the Artifact Analysis Key Assessment for EDCO 220, which is our Assessment to Meet Diverse Needs course. Now the good news about this assessment is that you should be completing it as you go throughout the course, which means that you have been given ample opportunity for formative feedback and hopefully some peer assessment as well. So to give you an overview of the assessment, this is what we call a portfolio assessment, which means that you're collecting your work and presenting the best work you have toward the end of the semester. So you are required to have 5 different artifacts that address some of the most important content that we cover in EDCO 220. So the 4 content areas that we will address are standards and learning objectives, the purpose of assessment, being diagnostic, formative, or summative, and you'll notice there are 2 artifacts with that topic, informative feedback, and rubrics. So candidates reflect on the artifacts in their portfolio in the analysis and application chart, and this chart should look familiar, at least in the sense of the questions should be familiar because they should match the questions that you completed for the artifacts throughout the semester. So let's scroll down and look at the template that you will fill out. So here's your artifact and analysis and application chart. So this is split up by gray bars, and you'll see that each gray bar is a different artifact. So artifact 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, within this chart, you're only answering the discussion questions. So the first thing that you're doing is scrolling to the very bottom, okay? This is when you're uploading your pictures. So artifact 1 is this standard and learning objectives chart that you should have completed for a class assignment. So you're literally just copying and pasting, excuse me, that's a typo. You're just copying and pasting this chart that you created for your artifact in this final portfolio. Artifact 2, this is where you're inserting a picture of your sample assessment that you analyzed, and the same thing for Artifact 3. Artifact 4 is your informative feedback chart. Again, you should have already completed this chart for a class or homework assignment, so you're just copying and pasting it there. And lastly, Artifact 5 is your sample rubric. So at the very bottom of this template, I should be able to see the 5 artifacts that you are analyzing in the discussion questions. So let's scroll back up to my analysis chart. So for example, Artifact 1. This is corresponding to your standards and learning objective chart that you should have copy and pasted at the bottom of the document. First, you're answering your analysis questions, and then your application questions to the future classroom. These questions should be very familiar, as you should have already answered them in your discussion questions for a class or homework assignment. Something that I really want to stress is that if students simply copy and paste from their work they completed in class into this template, they typically are not going to do very well. And the reason for that is this class is always building on new topics. So back in the very beginning of the semester, when you first started learning about standards and learning objectives, you didn't really know much about other content. So for the final project, it's up to you to go back and really add as much course information as possible. So it's not a simple matter of cut and paste. I like to think of those initial drafts as your rough draft, and that is why I have you fill them out as the semester goes on. So none of these questions should be surprising. You have your analysis questions and then your application to the future classroom questions. One thing to be very clear on, these analysis questions should be based on the artifact you found. So, for example, in Artifact 2, Sample Assessment A, that means that down at the bottom of my template, right here, I have a picture of an assessment that I either created or found. So up in Artifact 2 section of my assignment, I should be answering these analysis questions specifically about the sample assessment I provided. So I'm discussing how I would use this assessment for diagnostic, formative, or summative purposes. Then I would propose one learning objective that would align to this sample assessment. Then I would discuss issues of reliability and validity related to that specific assessment. So I need to be able to see clear alignment between these analysis questions and whatever you are inputting at the bottom for your artifacts. Now, the application questions, however, are answered in general. What does that mean? I want you to think about your future classroom. So how will you use diagnostic or assessment for diagnostic purposes in your future classroom? Well, there are a lot of ways that you could do that. To guide instruction, let's say you're about to start a new unit and I want to know what my students already know about the content, so I'm going to use an assessment for diagnostic purposes. The example I just gave you is actually really vague. I want you to be as specific as saying, before completing a unit on persuasive writing, I would have my students do a quick write for 3 to 5 minutes to persuade me to cancel homework for the rest of the semester. That's a lot more specific, and I can see how you may use that in your classroom. Based on your diagnostic assessment, you then need to be able to explain, well, how would you analyze that data? Would you do a frequency distribution? Would you do an item analysis? How would that inform your differentiation? Would you differentiate for readiness or maybe for interest? Okay, so you're being very hypothetical and you're giving as much detail as possible. Carrying this same example over, I could probably use diagnostic assessment to determine the impact on learning, because that way, when I give a pre-test of some sort, I'm establishing a good foundation, and then I can see how much my students actually grew. So the key here for these application questions is you need to think hypothetically for your future classroom. So let's do another topic rather. How would you use rubrics or checklists in your future classroom? So let's say that I am a future band director and I want to do a weekly performance in small groups. What am I using a rubric for? Am I grading them on sight reading perhaps? Am I grading them on different techniques? Am I grading them on different types of notes, if they're playing the correct note or not? You can realize I'm not perfect in my content knowledge of music, but you shouldn't just say, I'm doing a weekly check-in to see how their pieces are coming, right? That's really general. Tell me, are you looking at their dynamics? Or are you looking at their tones? What are you specifically grading for? And how could you use rubrics in that sense? So let's look at the rubrics that are associated. Again, that is your general, before we go to rubrics, that's your general template. So you have seen all of these questions before. Analysis and application, those are on each artifact that you have completed throughout the semester. And then at the bottom, you are posting or pasting rather in a image of the artifacts that you have collected. Again, it is not enough to simply copy and paste your artifacts into this template. You will not do well. You need to go back and revisit everything because now you have the full content knowledge. One thing that I would really suggest is that you use both the learning objectives that are at the beginning of each presentation and that sheet of terminology. Remember, you should all have a sheet of vocabulary that we have added to each class. That's beautiful right now. There's a reason to make you do that. Go back, pull out that sheet of professional vocabulary. I want to see you using that professional vocabulary within this artifact analysis. Lastly, I'd like to take a look at some of our rubrics. So you will notice that there is a rubric for each component of the artifact analysis. So this is your rubric for standards and learning objectives. This is your rubric for purpose of assessment, which is artifacts 2 and 3. Here's your rubric for informative feedback. And finally, your rubric for rubrics. So let's just look at one here. Let's look at purpose of assessment. See if I can get this on one page. A little bit too big. There we go. So the first thing that you'll see is that in order to receive full points, you need to attach the artifact, and I need to be able to read it. So for example, if you found a sample assessment, which you should have for this artifact, then you need to input that image, but don't make it so tiny that I can't read it. If you happen to have found a really long assessment, it's okay to just post the first few pages there. So either you do it or you don't, so you either get the 2 or 0 points. Now let's look at analysis. Remember, analysis is based on the specific artifact that you found. Teacher candidate, which is you, analyzes the validity, reliability, and appropriateness of assessments in alignment with learning goals. Okay, so this is really related to those discussion questions. That's why I asked you them very carefully. So you're clearly discussing how the assessment could be used for diagnostic, formative, or summative purposes. You are providing learning objectives that align, and you're giving a thorough analysis with specific examples, right? So what I've already done is kind of go through and bold some things for you. If you see something bolded, that means it's important. So you're discussing how this assessment could be used for diagnostic, formative, or summative purposes. Don't just randomly write a learning objective. Make sure it's aligned with the assessment. Give very thorough analysis with specific examples of reliability and validity. So it's not enough to say the assessment is valid because it measures what we want it to. How do we know that? It could be the assessment is valid because it is clearly aligned to the proposed 4 learning objectives. As you can see, items 1 through 5 align to learning objective 1. Okay, so that's the difference in terms of specificity. Okay, application to the future classroom. Okay, again, let's focus on exemplary. Teacher candidate discusses in detail how assessments used for diagnostic, formative, or summative purposes can be used to guide instruction and to determine student learning. Again, specific ideas or examples, are provided, and the discussion is forward thinking. So I want to hear you say, in my future classroom, when I am the teacher, I will do X. Okay? So what I would highly suggest you do is what I just did. For each of your artifacts, go through and highlight, circle, underline, everything you need to do in order to receive exceeds expectation. This will look slightly different depending upon the artifact. So for example, in informative feedback, make sure within your chart you are addressing strengths and needs. You're providing specific strategies. You're giving a detailed instruction. Okay? So as you are inputting all of your artifacts and you're answering your analysis and application questions, make sure that you're looking over your rubric to be sure that you're receiving full points. Again, this is your key assessment for a course, so it is quite important. That being said, I do feel that you are all prepared to do very well, particularly if you have kept up with uploading your artifacts and given me the opportunity to provide some feedback. We are taking an entire week to have a work session on this, so that doesn't mean it's a week off. It means that it's a week for you to really put your best foot forward in this project. As always, if you have any questions, you can call me during my virtual office hours, and I will also create a discussion board for you to post your questions. Thank you.